needs no introduction. She's a chartered and registered forensic psychologist, a best-selling author. She's worked in various roles within forensic psychology and as a motivational speaker. And what I've seen in your work is it can really translate the work we do into everyday language people can understand. And I also found out today that she did backing vocals for Kid Creole and the Coconuts.
I did.
I'm fascinated to ask you about, having seen Kid Creole and the Coconuts, and you weren't with them then.
No. Well, I only would have been about 7 or 8 years old because this was
wow.
in the 80s. Yes, and I also did backing vocals for ABBA.
Oh, wow.
I Have a Dream for the Nolans, yeah, for Cliff Richards, you name it, all of these 80s celebrities, because I was in St. Winifred's School Choir. So rather sickening group of predominantly little girls in flowery pink dresses, and they had a #1 hit record with There's No One Quite Like Grandma. It was a Christmas #1. It actually knocked John Lennon off the top of the charts, believe it or not.
Claim to fame.
Yeah, I can't carry a tune in a bucket. I really can't. If you've ever heard me on karaoke, it's not, you won't want to hear it again, put it that way. But it allowed me to have all of these experiences as, as a primary school child. And I just assumed that everybody else did this. So I literally thought that every other child met these celebrities at the weekend and sang with them. And that was just part of how it was if you were a kid. So I didn't quite realise how lucky I was, but yeah, that's my 80s claim to fame.
Oh, well, that's amazing. So you're best-selling author and a #1 singer.
Yeah, well, actually, do you know what? They had 2 #1s, and they were the only one-hit wonder to have a one-hit wonder twice, and went in the Guinness World Book of Records.
What was your second #1?
The second #1 was There's No One Quite Like Grandma, and prior to that, there was a song which was it was a tribute to L.S. Lowry. It was called Matchstalk Men and Matchstalk Cats and Dogs.
I didn't know they sang. So when did you start telling us then, Kerry, how you got into being a forensic psychologist?
I've told this story a few times. I wanted to go into advertising. That was my aim. And there was a careers counsellor at school who said, if you want to go into advertising, then a psychology degree is a really good way to go about it. So I signed up for psychology at Sheffield University. And then I made this, what turned out to be actually a life-changing decision based on just the worst of criteria. There was a really good-looking boy in the queue for law subsidiaries. And I never actually got up the courage to speak to him, but a love affair grew anyway from the back of the lecture theatre, because I became very, very interested in the law, but I was enjoying psychology as well, because it took a while to click for me, but it did eventually. So I was thinking, well, how can I marry these 2 disciplines together? And I had always had an interest, I think, in true crime. I used to read true crime books. And I was always interested in, shall we say, the unusual aspects of human behaviour. I remember as a child reading Roald Dahl, Tales of the Unexpected, and watching those television programs. So it just seemed like a natural choice for me. And somebody actually said to me, oh, forensic psychology, that, working in a prison, that's no job for a woman. Now we know, don't we, that actually it really is a job for women, because the vast majority of forensic psychologists, over 84%, I think when I last checked, were women. But that was a bit like a red rag to a bull. So it's like, oh right, you think it's no job for a woman? I'll show you.
Yeah.
But at that point I wouldn't have changed my mind even if I'd wanted to. So I started to think very, very early on, really, and which turned out to be the thing to do, because we know how difficult it is to get your foot on the first rung of the ladder, really, into forensic psychology. But when I was at university, one of the first things that I did was I went down to the town centre in Sheffield, and I went to their volunteer bureau and asked them what kind of positions that they had that might help me in this career path. And so I became an appropriate adult while I was at university, sitting in on police interviews with suspects or witnesses also that were considered vulnerable, usually as a result of a learning disability, but there were people there with mental health problems or you know, you name it, whatever, what that they were considered vulnerable. And it was just really interesting, and it was a really good training for me, alongside what I was doing at university. At the weekends, I was going away and I was training on things like the peace model of investigation that the police use, that had just come in. That came in 1992, which is the same year that I started university. So I was getting to do all of these things, and I developed that interest in investigative interviewing and the way that it can go right and the way that it can go wrong. And before I'd even left university, I'd already done courses on things like cognitive interviews or Ekman's approach, that kind of thing. So it stood me in good stead, I think. But the first thing that I actually did after graduating from university was apply to various prisons, asking if they had any volunteer work that they, you know, would allow me to do. So I spent a good 6 months after university working voluntarily in a prison, just to get my foot in the door, really.
It's a really familiar story, actually. I think my first year was working as a volunteer, and it's almost like, it's not an expectation that you'd go off and have these experiences, but it's a way into the profession, almost working for free. I'm not sure if it's the same in other professions, but it feels like the way to get into psychology still feels you've got to try and either get in volunteer or find something that's similar, like you were saying, the appropriate adult or substance misuse work or something in the area.
I know, and you know, it's so difficult if you can't afford to do that, because I was very lucky that my parents helped me out. Not that they were rich by any stretch of the imagination, but I didn't have to work my way through university as a lot of people do. I always say quite a good thing to do to get your foot in the door and also find out whether this is the right environment for you is actually to get paid work, maybe as a healthcare worker in a secure hospital, or I've known people that have worked as auxiliaries in you know, in the prison service, and so that's an option. But I think that a lot of people that would be great forensic psychologists maybe fall by the wayside, because you say that it's not an expectation, but I think that it's so competitive to make your CV stand out and to give an employer, I think, you know, faith that actually you're gonna last the distance. You really do need these extra experiences on your CV. And I did all kinds of everything. I did everything that I possibly could. Any course that Bernardo's were willing to send me on, I went, and I did counselling training as well. So all manner of things. So I was a busy girl at university.
You have worked in so many different settings. How have you found moving from all the various settings? What's that been like?
Yeah, I don't know whether, I suppose I'm a jack of all trades, really, or a Jill of all trades, and probably a mistress of none. I think I've either been incredibly lucky to be able to work in these different areas, or I've just been absolutely chaotic. I'm not quite sure what it is. I didn't move very, very quickly. You know, I spent a good couple of years in each setting. So, and the majority of my time at the beginning of my career was spent in secure units. So I don't suppose I felt like I was shuttling around. I think that came later when I started doing private work. And as I say, I had this interest all the way along in investigative interviewing and police interviews, how they're conducted. And my plan was to make a bit of extra cash and to start doing a couple of days a week private work, which a lot of NHS psychologists do. And so I had thought that maybe I would be instructed by solicitors who wanted me to look at interviews that had been conducted with their clients, and that was certainly the case. I was often asked to deconstruct and analyse, ABE interviews, achieving best evidence interviews with children, or interviews that had resulted in confessions which later somebody had said was a coerced false confession. So again, I spent a lot of time going down this particular rabbit hole and doing all of the training that I possibly could, thinking that, you know, this is going to put me in court. But in actual fact, as well as being an expert witness, what happened was I would then come into contact with the police that usually I was pulling apart, to be honest, or their work. I was pulling apart their work. And eventually what started to happen is they would come to me and say, we are planning an interview. Will you help us, or could you just come and take a look? And you've got to remember that this was in the early 2000s. Whereas these days, I wouldn't expect the police to make a direct, you know, call to a forensic psychologist that's actually predominantly working in a secure unit. But in those days, that is actually what they did, because those central services and the training of police officers in forensic psychology and investigative methods was still, you know, it was very much in its infancy. So I think that I benefited from the era, really, that I was in. So I think people think that when you're interviewing suspects, that you are engaging in mind games with them, or you're trying to crack them. In fact, I was at CrimeCon this weekend, and one of the questions that I was asked, we were talking about the investigation into Beverly Allitt and her interviews. And somebody said, you know, how do you crack somebody like Beverly Allitt? Well, you don't. It's not about trying to crack people. You know, that's not what we do. It's just about trying to get the best possible information that will lead you to the next piece of evidence that might be pivotal in building a case against this person, or it might be taking you to the next piece of evidence that actually rules them out as a suspect. So there's no mind games involved. There's certainly no taking them around the back of the police station and beating them around the head with, you know, the Glasgow Herald or anything like that. It always amazes me what people think I do as a forensic psychologist. But actually, the larger proportion of what I have done with the police has been all around the interview procedure. But it's you know, it's a huge piece of work, interviews, police interviews. They really are, and they're just so central to an investigation.
Mm. I was thinking how much it lent to research skills. As you were talking then, just that idea that you're pulling out themes and you're thinking about, you know, what groups where does this happen? What are you listening out for? It really lends itself to the skills of psychologists, really.
Yeah, it really does. And as I say, I'm sure that there are people much better at it now who are employed by the police service. I still get asked in sometimes, kind of as an old hand, really. But you know, things have changed. Things have changed so much, and investigative psychology has really blossomed as a subject. And one of the things that always put me off, I think, a master's in investigative psychology is just how much statistics are involved, because actually I'm really dreadful at statistics, but I was always quite good at the qualitative analysis, and I really did find that came in handy. And I think there's just something, I don't know whether it's trained into me over the years or whether it's part and parcel of my personality, but I like to pull out themes and I like to categorize things. But we all do, don't we, as human beings, too much, I think. So yeah, all of those skills really do come in handy. And I remember the police being so grateful and almost thinking that, oh, I must have some sort of magical abilities. And I really didn't. I just read a good few books about various different models and was able to apply them. So there's no magic, there's no mystery to investigative psychology.
Investigative psychology, I mean, that as a discipline has only recently, I went to their inaugural conference, which is only, it seems like a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 or 7 now, but yeah, I mean, it's recent years. I mean, lots have blossomed, as you said, in the last 20 years, a lot's changed.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder, should I have gone into investigative psychology as distinct from forensic psychology? But then, you know, I've had such a great time as a forensic psychologist and working with people on a one-to-one basis and all of the therapy that I've done, I don't know, I just feel very, very blessed that I've been able to have one foot, really, I suppose, in that camp, alongside the work that I do that maybe is more representative of what forensic psychologists do.
Lots of questions that I've been asked definitely in the trainee world is, how do I get into police? Like, how can I become a forensic psychologist in police? And it seems like the jobs that are available are very limited, and maybe that's, like we're saying, because it's more on the investigative psychology route.
Yeah, and I always say that maybe you need to consider actually working as a police officer and going in that way, and then doing training from there, because I think that's the route in these days. But I mean, this is it. I mean, I think I must be on my third or fourth career now. I never thought that I would be an author. I mean, I still don't consider myself a writer, but forensic psychology, I think, can open up lots of different avenues for people if you follow what you're passionate about and you're prepared to look for opportunities.
I mean, I really enjoyed your books. I think you had, as I said at the beginning, got a really nice way of translating what we do into everyday language. It's very readable. It's not like a textbook. It's very readable to read. And I could really relate to your career as a psychologist in very different ways. But did you find that cathartic to write? Because they were very, it's very revealing what you wrote.
Yeah, they are revealing. The first one, I've got to be honest, my hair literally started to fall out. And I think that was the result of several factors, not least the fact that I only had 3 months to write it. And I don't consider myself a writer. I'm used to writing court reports, but nothing like this. But also, there were some really deeply personal stories to me in that book, The Dark Side of the Mind, and things that I hadn't thought about for many, for decades, really. And going back and revisiting them, I've got to admit, I did shed quite a few tears for my younger self. And I did shed a few tears just seeing how far that I'd come, really. That was a real revelation to me, just seeing how different I am now as a person. And also, I got great feedback from ex-offenders and great feedback from people with mental health problems. And that was, I was blown away by that. It was very, very satisfying. I have to say that having written that book, I think it's one of the most impactful things that I have ever done. And I'm so grateful to everybody who's read it and responded to it, because it's resonated with them in some way, shape or form. So the second book was a lot easier to write because it wasn't as deeply personal to me. And I'd started to tell more of my clients' stories. And yes, you get my thoughts and feelings as a psychologist, and times where maybe, my emotions have overtaken me, etc., etc. But you don't get quite as much of my story in there. And I laughed a lot more at my own jokes, my own poor jokes, when writing that book. And I think that I wasn't so terrified about how potentially it could be received. I had a little bit more confidence when I was writing it.
What was the decision to actually write a book when you first thought I'd really like to talk to other people about what I've done in my career? What made you make that decision?
Well, I'd started, again, really by accident almost, appearing in crime documentaries as a talking head. And so often people would say things to me that really surprised me about what they thought that I do. So people would think that I chop up dead bodies, or that I'm literally wrestling suspects to the ground with the police. And so, it's quite an eye-opener. And I suppose it's because they watch all of these dramas, don't they? And so I started to think about all the tropes that you see on TV and all the myths around forensic psychology. And actually, I was approached to write a book. And again, I think what it was that people thought that it was very unusual that a woman should work in forensic psychology, because actually who you see on television tend to be older males, don't they? And in academia. So I think that I was being held up as something quite unusual. And I was asked if I would like to write a book, and some of the suggestions that were put to me, I could write a book about serial killers. I could write a book about, notorious killers and profiling. And I could write a book. Oh, here's one suggestion. I could write a book about different forms of mental disorder and how they all relate to being, being dangerous. And I just thought, good God, what I want to do is actually be the antidote to all of these dreadful tropes that are out there.
What about when you're writing about people that you've worked with in prison, how do you have to navigate your way through that confidentiality? Do you have to let them know that you're writing about them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there was me thinking, right, I'm going to take a bit of a break from being an expert witness, because I've got a book to write, so I'm not going to be involved in any complex legal proceedings for the next, few months at least. Oh my God. It's such a minefield. It really is. The book has to go through a very expensive legal read, and you have to either have the permission of the people that you are writing about, which is incredibly difficult with the people that I was predominantly writing about, because if they were sectioned under the Mental Health Act, then there was big issues to do with, did they have actually capacity to give me permission? If they were having active symptoms of mental distress, then could I, in all honesty, take a signed, yes, that's fine for you to talk about my case, and actually, give that any kind of, have faith in that, have trust in that. So in the end, what I ended up doing is, I hate to say this because I know that some people are really very, very attached to some of the characters, or the people rather, in my books, but I wrote about people who have already passed on predominantly, and that's why a lot of it is from my early career in the first book. And I went through a huge process of disguising things, so even to the point that I had to make sure that my CV was no longer available on LinkedIn and on various places on the internet. Because as much as I'd like to say exactly the hospitals where I've worked, unfortunately that would help to identify people. So I've had to kind of obliterate my work history. Trust me, I do have a work history.
Not to sort of, I suppose I just want to mention kind of the victims of people involved here. Have you had any? I suppose I was thinking, it's a difficult one anyway, being a psychologist. I think even when we write reports, we're very conscious of not having perhaps consent from the victims to write about their names, and I think it's always been something when we're writing reports, I'm always conscious of perhaps just using an initial, or it's always sort of on my mind. So how did you manage all of that?
Yeah, again, if they could be contacted and would agree, then that's great. I tried to write about the victims in the most respectful and dignified way that I possibly could. And again, they are disguised in the same way as the perpetrators are described. But I've had really good feedback actually from people who have been victims, because the book isn't just about, and this is it, people divide the people that we work with into, well, victims or offenders, and actually there's often huge overlap. So I think that is a theme that comes through, or I hope it comes through very loud and clear in my books.
And how have you found it moving from the different settings, from hospitals to prisons to television? Your new series starts tonight again on Quest.
Yeah, faking it. And I love faking it because it's about one of my favourite subjects, because we look at police interviews, and we look at also public appeals by perpetrators. And again, it's all rooted in the science of lie detection, and very much based in Ekman's work, but also the new models of lie detection, which are around clusters of behaviours that if they appear within 7 seconds across, I think it's something like, if we see 3 tells over 2 separate communication channels of the 6 channels in 7 seconds, and then that's a reliable indicator of deception. So there's real science underpinning this, even though clearly it's done for entertainment. But Shearwater Media, who make Faking It, allow me to get on my high horse about things. So they let me be a bit of a social justice warrior. So they let me dispel some myths. So you'll see me talking about the myth of men who snap and kill their partners, for example. You'll see me getting upset about certain ways that police have investigated certain crimes. So again, it's a really good opportunity to bring this kind of information in a relatable and accessible way to, you know, just anybody who is interested in it, because I do believe that psychology is for everybody. It's not just for you know, the few people that can afford to go off and study it. So yeah, I love that. Television has been strange. The move into television has been strange because when you appear on TV, even in quite a minor capacity, I don't think anything can prepare you for the amount of nonsense that you get in your inbox. The fact that you've got to then be on Twitter, which sometimes I feel quite uncomfortable about. Being a woman in the public eye, I think has really, if I wasn't feminist enough to start with, then it's certainly made me even more so. And it's funny because everybody thinks that working in prisons or in secure units is incredibly dangerous and that we need to cover ourselves in Kevlar. But in actual fact, I've found it's far more dangerous to be a woman who appears on television. So that has certainly revealed parts of society to me that maybe, well, I always knew existed, but I've never seen it really quite so in multicolour technical form as I do now that I'm appearing on TV. I think I found the move from hospitals to working with the police fairly easy. I think that whenever I was working with the police, I'd been specifically invited, and that of course always helps, doesn't it? But obviously I've sometimes walked into a meeting and I've seen that, you know, roll of the eye, oh my God, you know, who's she? Or what can a psychologist possibly contribute to this? But by and large, I found it okay. The only thing that I did find difficult in the early days is, I suppose, like anybody that watched Line of Duty, you know, with a notebook trying to note down all the different acronyms.
Yeah.
You know, I would sit in meetings and I would hear all of these terms and I'd make notes, and people were probably thinking that I was making, you know, very psychological notes, and it weren't. It was just like, right, what does this mean? So go away and study afterwards. So literally I would spend the rest of the evening on Google trying to figure out what all of these different things meant.
One of the things we ask everyone that comes on here is what do you see in your future of forensic psychology? What are you mentioned earlier about certain social issues that you'd like to speak about and perhaps bust a few myths over. What does your future look like?
Well, this is it. As I said before, this is the first time I've probably not had a 5-year plan. So I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, I know that there's going to be a couple more books. And I know that I think the next book is going to be me going full fat feminist. I think it's going to focus on women that I've worked with. I'm talking to TV production companies about programs to do with femicide, which is, you know, sadly in the news at the moment, because I'm utterly shocked at just, well, the lack of progress that we've made in terms of tackling this problem over, if I look at my career, and we've gathered so much information really that shows us very clearly and can predict when femicide will occur. So, you know, what is going wrong? I'm also doing more training for the police, and not only in terms of how they interview suspects and interview witnesses, but I've started training police in how they investigate stalking and how they investigate complaints of domestic abuse. So I think, you know, I don't have any grand plan. I'm going to do whatever I'm now in a fantastic position where I can turn things down because I get more invitations to do things or requests and referrals to do things than I've possibly got any time for. I'm of course going to consider, you know, the referrals that I get for parole boards, etc., because I want to be still a forensic psychologist. So I want to keep, you know, that kind of work ongoing.
And I think we've all felt very passionate about forensic psychology and how you, as Laura said, you know, you're doing one thing, but you're applying another part of your skills. And I think that's what we've all really enjoyed about it, is that you could be doing research, but you're actually investigating, and you're applying. There are so many cross skills that you're using in different areas.
Yeah, and what I found is that one job then leads to thoughts about another area of psychology, and leads you to go and learn more about that. And then you look at the news in a different way, and you think, well, hang on, this needs to change. What can I possibly do here? So it's a subject that just, well, it's constantly evolving, and you can constantly evolve with it if you want to. It's a really exciting area. I'm glad that I chose this. And I think that one of the best things that happened to me is, well, I was stalked as a result of appearing on television, and I bought a dog because it made me feel safer. So I actually ended up with 2 huge chow chows, and that forced me to go out walking, and it was just the best form of mindfulness, really, you know, the best form of stress relief. So yeah, I recommend that. You've just got to take some time out and clear your mind, I think, in this on a regular basis, whatever works for you.
And did you manage to get it resolved, the person who was stalking you?
Yes, eventually. It took a long time. It took many years, and again was an eye-opener in just how poor we were, and still are, I think, in some areas, in dealing with stalking complaints. So it wasn't resolved how I would have liked it to have been resolved, but I haven't had any problems that I know of since. What I suspect is that probably some other woman has probably become the focus of that person's attention. So I'm not too happy about that. But I at least I'm not having any problems. And again, it was something that I was able to turn into a positive, because it was something that I learned more about, and now I train police and get an awful lot of satisfaction in knowing that hopefully you know, people will have a better experience than I had when I reported it.
Interesting, because it must be terrifying when it's happening. They must feel very lonely when it's happening to you.
Yeah, and I think that the strange thing was, and this is actually, I think we've all been reading over the last week, haven't we, about, of course, the person who murdered Sarah Everard. And we've all been thinking very much about our own safety, really, and where are we safe. And of course, we know that we are more likely to be assaulted in our own homes by men that we know, but then we start to think about, well, are we safe on the street? And certainly at the point that I was being stalked, the safest place I felt was at work, because I was literally behind locked doors with alarms and lots of people around. And that's quite ironic, really, isn't it, that that's where you would feel the safest. But I didn't feel safe in my home, and I certainly didn't feel safe on the street, because I didn't know who this man was. I didn't know what he looks like until I saw him in court. And so he literally could have been any man that was behind me in Sainsbury's, or, you know, behind me when I was walking down the road with my dog. And so it was a really terrifying, nerve-shattering time. And when you're trying to live with your stress levels set that high, you know, it has a real physical impact. It makes you ill. So I'm very glad that is over. But I certainly have sat and reflected over the last week about just women's day-to-day experience, and how safe, you know, many women feel, or don't feel, rather.
Yeah, I think it's the other extreme, because I often used to go out walking early in the morning, and if there was a man behind me, I'd be terrified. And I'm thinking, well, the poor man is probably just doing the same as I'm doing, just going out for a walk. But you'd almost feel that there's an expectation, and we'll have to get away from him, as if he can't just walk past me. I mean, it is, and I don't think men obviously realise that's the effect they have. They're just going about their day. They don't, not having been in that situation, they probably have no idea.
And of course, it's, you know, it's not them being unkind, but it's them being insensitive, really, to women's experience, because, as you say, they've not considered it, because they don't have to change their behaviour. but just crossing over to the other side of the road, or saying, I'm all right, you know, I'm here, I'm crossing over,
I'm just walking my dog.
yeah, exactly, can make all of the difference. It's just that unfortunately, when you say what men can do, then you just get an absolute backlash, don't you, where they say, oh, well, it's not all men, and you know, why are you asking good men to be better? Well, I'm asking good men to be better because the onus is always put on women. And actually, when you look at who is really leading the charge in terms of research and changing legislation, changing investigative practices, and trying to eradicate this problem, this huge societal problem, it's women. And it's not a woman's problem, really, is it? It's a man's problem. So we need more men to get on board and be allies. But unfortunately, it can get contentious.
Forward to your full fact feminism book.
Yeah,
and you know, and it's difficult. You don't want to do it in a way that's going to make men throw the book out the window before they've even read it, because it's certainly not an attack on men. And I think that what we have to understand is actually these gender roles and stereotypes, they really do harm men as well. I mean, look at the huge number of men who take their own lives in the space of a week. So I think that once we acknowledge that we're in it together, so again, it's about writing a book in the right tone, I think, and telling stories. I think that stories are so much more powerful than facts. Even people remember the stories, they don't necessarily remember the facts that go with the stories.
It's difficult because we've all worked with male staff who feel that sort of guilt for what other men have done when it's not them that's done it, but they feel that, you know, and I've felt it when I've seen, you know, either or that a generation of people have done something, or that you know, the white privilege things, we feel guilty for that when it wasn't us that did it, but we feel that sort of collective guilt. And I've worked with lots of officers particularly who sort of said, you know, I feel really bad that men do this to women, and we're like, well, no, it's not you that's done it.
I know a lot of police officers and homicide detectives that I've worked with, or I know personally, who are just feeling absolutely dreadful this week. After the you know, after the conviction of Wayne Couzens, and they are the good guys, but they realise that they've got a problem. You know, they've got a real problem with misogyny in the police force, because the police force, of course, is made up of people who are in our society, so it reflects our society. And they've got to weed out that problem and challenge it and deal with it. And I think that it can feel overwhelming at times when you look at the scale of the problem. But I really do feel for the police this week.
It feels like you're doing such amazing work in getting discussions about topics that are really difficult to talk about. Yeah, exactly. And you know, one of the chapters in my new book is about well, a sex offence against an elderly lady. So again, a really difficult topic, but it is possible to talk about these things, and it's important to talk about these things, and it's important to talk about, you know, where we fail and as much as where we succeed. So I think it's worth doing, and it's certainly possible to do it in a way. I think that, I mean, I haven't received much criticism as a result of my books, but I'm sure that some people look at them and think, oh well, you know, this is pop psychology, or you know, this is packaged for the mainstream, and it is packaged for the mainstream, and that's absolutely deliberate, because I want people to read it, I want to reach people. It's interesting to see what is happening with it. I do think that it's important, and I'm proud of it, so I'm quite happy for it to be mainstream and pop psychology, if that's the way that people see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we try to do on this channel, is to bring it into the mainstream, because people are really interested genuinely, but they don't want to read textbooks or hear,
exactly,
you know, academic papers.
And what you've got to understand is that people are all reading they're all reading the headlines in the news, aren't they? And they're all reading about things that go wrong, which actually they don't go wrong very often, with parole boards, etc., etc. So actually, it's really important that they understand how our systems work.
I agree. I feel like doing my master's and then going into prison, my master's taught me loads of things, but it didn't tell me about what on earth I could expect when I walked into a prison, and the kind of emotional experience and journey that I'd go on Your book, however, did give a bit of give a very, very good overview, in fact, of kind of what to expect in terms of the personal journey and all these sort of emotional experiences that you're going to have, which is, textbooks are wonderful, but they can't teach you that.
Really interesting what you said about the like in the chapter about sexual offences against older people, because there was a series on last week and this week about the Night Stalker, as he was called by the press. But what was really interesting is Colin Sutton was saying, you know, it didn't get in the press because people didn't want to read about that over their breakfast. And you think, you know, these women were being seriously sexually assaulted, some of them dying as a result, and yet people didn't want to read about that, so they didn't put it in the papers.
And actually, I was talking to Colin Sutton at the weekend. We're on a bus together, believe it or not. We're on the back of the bus at the Crime Con, and we were talking about that and just how under-resourced that investigation had been, because people didn't want to put it in the newspapers. And I'm always very conscious. And again, this week I've been thinking about the fact that when we hear about murders of women that happen, you know, in the street, they tend to be young, white, middle class, attractive victims. And we don't hear so much about Black women who are victims of violence. You know, why is that the case? So we get a very skewed perception, really, of the reality of what goes on. But Colin was saying about how they'd written a scene into Manhunt, which was a lovely scene where Martin Clunes is sitting with his colleague and just talking about the invisibility of old age and how none of us think that we're going to get there. None of us think that we're going to be that older person. And you know, those kind of things are so important, aren't they, in making people think? But also, you know, fingers crossed we don't get anything like that again, because it's such an awful series of offences. But if we do, it will be correctly resourced, and that people will actually talk about it in the media in a respectful way. But again, you know, that's the way that actually a television drama can impact in a positive way. So, you know, I'm all for that. And you never know. You know, I'm certainly in talks about my books becoming television dramas as well. So let's see what happens with that in the future.
Oh, well, it's been really lovely to talk to you, Kerry. I really appreciate your time, because you know how busy you are.
Yeah, anytime at all. No, thank you.
It's lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for your, thank you for being so positive about my books, because it really does make a difference to me when people that are my peers say, actually, this is okay. You know, I need that validation and reassurance. It helps me. So thank you.
So just for those of us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.